Craig, the reason you are here, and I've got that graph ready to go, so when you say bring it, it's ready to go. We want you to address this thing that Bish said, but a lot of people believe, and we're hearing now. I wrote down the word, the spend up. The spend up the last guys did, that if you listen to a Seymour, a Bishop, a Luxon, they are saying has put this country, we're in one of the worst states in the world from any country after going through COVID. They may not literally say that, but that's certainly the impression they're giving. So educate us, please, sir.
Sure. First of all, I'm indebted to musical chairs on both X and Blue Sky, who had pointed this out the first time, and I just needed to collect the data to make sure. The government's been accused because of an IMF calculation, so that's the International Monetary Fund, which has looked at all of what it calls the stimulus spending during COVID, and that put New Zealand second top in terms of the stimulus spending for COVID. The government has then used that as a stick to then say, look, we spent lots of money. That lots of money led to inflation. That inflation was the cost of living challenge that you're all facing. There is a relationship between these two things. Ergo, the previous government caused the problems that we have now. Right? Okay. The challenge we have is that that IMF chart is that COVID stimulus chart. What is considered COVID stimulus is simply whatever that country said COVID stimulus was, or labeled COVID stimulus. There are many programs around the world where government spent money, but it wasn't classified as COVID stimulus. The challenge for New Zealand is we labeled everything as COVID stimulus. And as a consequence, everything gets recorded as COVID stimulus. It makes New Zealand look much higher than it really is. So if it was true that New Zealand was the second top in terms of COVID stimulus, and as a consequence, we were able, therefore, we should be able to trace that in the CPI data and the Consumer Price Index data, and we should see New Zealand clear and far away of every other advanced or developed country in the world that was also delivering stimulus packages around the time. And if you pull the chart up, Pat, you can see a chart which has lots of grey and black lines on. These are the 35 countries of the European Union, Japan, Korea, Singapore, the US, Canada, a range of other developed countries around the world. And what you can see is a red line inside all of those grey lines. That red line is New Zealand. And that is New Zealand inflation versus the rest of the world's inflation during that period of time. What you can see is that New Zealand's inflation is bang average in comparison to everywhere else. So we can take this back to 2016 when New Zealand's inflation was bang average. We can take this forward to Q2 2025 when New Zealand's inflation is bang average. We can see during the middle when COVID turns up. So you can see sort of essentially from 2020 Q3 onwards, there's the spike, the increase in New Zealand when inflation for us reached the grand sum of 7 and a bit percent. Around the rest of the world, it was spiking up to 25. Now, around the rest of the world, there were also some other reasons why that was the case. So some of those countries are jurisdictions that bordered with the Ukraine at that point in time, and there were reasons for the inflation at that point there. But New Zealand's inflation experience is unremarkable in comparison to any other jurisdiction in the world. So the relationship between that COVID spending and that CPI inflation, there's no relationship in this chart. There is, however, just simply a story of global inflation driving inflation in the majority of countries right around the world, and then easing. And New Zealand's easing cycle happens, as you see, in exactly the same way as the rest of the world's easing cycle happens. Again, there's nothing exciting or new or different about this data.
It's almost like you're saying it didn't really, or it probably didn't matter who was in charge over COVID, but generally the New Zealand government pre-COVID, during COVID, and now post-COVID has stayed exactly where it's pretty much always been for inflation, which is boringly in the middle.
And that's because New Zealand is a global price taker for many goods. right? New Zealand, we don't set the price of oil. We just take it, right? And as a consequence, when the price of oil goes up, guess what? We have inflation, right? When the price of wheat, when the price of other imported foodstuffs comes to New Zealand, we don't set the price for those goods. That is globally set. So as a consequence, we experience global inflation. Unsurprisingly, our inflation therefore looks like global inflation. When you see, as we did during COVID, the price of international shipping spiked because ships weren't leaving anywhere, right? Now, why does that affect New Zealand? Well, New Zealand is 3 time zones away from the nearest other country. So any global shipping impact flows through to pricing in New Zealand, where we like to think of ourselves as a plucky country, and we are, at the bottom of the South Pacific, right? Great. But in economic terms, what's happened with inflation is we are amongst the most average countries anywhere in the developed world.
I mean, Craig, it sounds like what you're describing is, tell me if this is fair. Because of our isolation, we should have done better than most with the COVID virus, which we kind of did. But because of our isolation, we probably should have done worse than most when it comes to inflation. And we didn't. We stayed average. Is that a fair statement?
Well, certainly being isolated from the rest of the world gave us the opportunity to do well during COVID, our relative isolation, and the fact we don't have land borders where people can, walk over. We executed that really well, and we got the good results that we saw. But you're right, because we're such an importer of many essential goods in New Zealand, that also meant we were much more exposed to global inflation. Our global inflation arguably could have been much higher, because tradable inflation, the stuff we import, the physical stuff we import, we have to import it. We don't have any other means of getting it here. So, inflation could have been much higher. One of the ironies here is that many of the government's programs may well have helped to contribute to inflation remaining lower, because there was money in pockets. People didn't have spikes in demand. People were still able to go to the shops. People were still able to do things. And as a consequence, that's why our inflation arguably looks better than it could have done for a country which was so isolated when global supply chains essentially stopped.
Now, how do we inform the other 5.555999 million New Zealanders about this, so we don't have to sit there and hear the bullshit again and again and again and again? How do we inform the journalists who get to talk to these guys how to actually then ask the next question when Luxon goes off about 7% inflation and how terrible and the spend up, and how do we get that out there?
Well, this is not new news, right? This data is publicly available. It's widely disseminated by international organizations. There are plenty of people who could be going out there and saying, well, was New Zealand's experience unique or different or unusual? And they're not. They're not, because there's no story in that. It's not much of a story for me coming along and saying there's no story here. It doesn't sell any newspapers.
Yeah.
Right. The challenge we have is, how do we sell that as a story of essentially the challenge that you've been sold, and the response to that challenge, which is to cut public services, which is to cut benefits for 18, 19-year-olds, right? To roll back essential investment in New Zealand because we were all doing it a bit tough, right? Prices were all a bit high. These things don't necessarily need to be happening in the way they are, because our inflation experience looks just like everywhere else.
Yeah. Chewie, anything you want to throw at the our human calculator here before we let him go?
I'm just amazed that an isolated trading nation didn't escape any consequences when it comes to the economy or inflation. Like, the government seems to be pretty unhappy. If you could hit the rewind button and go into the COVID situation with one single focus, we can't have any inflation. The lines can't move. That's the only thing we're worried about, because the election's down the road. What would we have had to do to keep that line flat?
We could have adopted what Spain did. during various parts of the cost of living challenges, which is price controls.
Right.
You could have said rent is going to remain flat. You could have said we're going to regulate pricing in supermarkets. You could have said we're going to introduce rationing for various goods and services, right? That is one means by which you could have achieved the price stability, Chewie, that you wish. It probably wouldn't have lasted very long, because you would have created very large black markets for all these goods and services. But in terms of they're frankly what the government of the day took the scientific evidence and said the best economic response is the best public health response. And that's what we prove, was that the best public health response, the response that saved thousands of lives, right, meant that we saw our economy didn't collapse, right? We saw a downturn in the immediate COVID period because we shut the country down. But when we opened the borders back up, it rose back again. Apart from that shutdown period, there was no recession under the previous government. Growth was 2.4% at the last election on average. Growth at this next quarter is likely to be negative again because we've kicked the confidence out of the economy by doing many of the things the government thought it needed to do to tackle the cost of living, when our experience looks just like everywhere else.
Yeah. Hey, we've got a request here. Marion wants that graph on a t-shirt. Sounds like we've got some maybe some locked out merch.
That's what
out.
Craig's.
That's
what your merch
here.
line.
Yeah.
That's what the locked out merch line is going to be, is just a series of t-shirts with graphs on them.
Now, speaking of episode for tomorrow, featuring G News. This is this information photo that we've talked about with that graph. That's from tomorrow's episode, but there's a lot more as well. Do you want to give us a bit of a précis for what's happening in tomorrow's show?
Sure. So the Treasury's put out a document called its long-term insights briefing. That insight briefing essentially is a sort of a manual, a kind of an instruction to government about how the country might respond if we had another downturn or another big shock like COVID or a war or something else. And what would the government do? And what should the government do with its fiscal policy, i.e. spending, taxation, investment, all of that stuff? It will not shock you to understand that the Treasury doesn't like spending, likes tidy accounts, and thinks that the best thing that can happen is that we do extremely little at all. But it says that in lots more words and, frankly, some fairly troubling analysis on the way through. So I won't spoil the fun or ruin the ending, but there are plenty of things again in there to get pretty annoyed about, because the Treasury essentially believes that shoulder pads, telethons, and smoking indoors, the 1980s are back, and they're back for fiscal policy, and we should fight that as hard as is humanly possible, because I come from a country where we applied that fiscal policy in the 1980s, and the communities back where I'm from are still struggling as a consequence.
And all the Craig Renney fans, not all of them, that would sound wrong, but some of the Craig Renney fans are down for this. There's already 3 people waiting for that to go live at 4 a.m. tomorrow morning. So, they're getting down. The Renneys. What do we call like the people who are your fans?
Oh, good Lord.
That works, doesn't it? Are you a Renney? I'm a Renney. Oh, look, here we go. People are even already talking. First comment, and they want a graph t-shirt. So there you go. All right, Craig. Hey, look, thanks for jumping on. Apologies, we took longer to get to you than we thought, but always appreciate your analysis. That episode comes out, if you're watching us on YouTube, on this network, the Big Hairy Network, at 4 a.m. tomorrow morning. It's on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and the other podcast places pick it up as well. But they're the 3 best places for you to find it: YouTube, Apple, or Spotify. Thanks, Craig. And I know that, just to say, Chewie, we are in a safe space. I know you're a bit freaked out not to see like a collar on with Craig. I know that's a bit scary when you see him like in
Oh,
after hours
that sort of
clothes.
collar. Sorry, went to a completely different place. Shirt and tie. Gotcha.
It's a very different show, Chewie.
Yeah.
But
That's for patrons only. That one.
yes,
After
it is.
Dusk.
Hey, is that his late night show Locked Up?
Locked up. There you go. Hey, thanks, Craig. Have a good one,
On
mate.
that
All the
one,
best. All right, cheers.
Thanks.
then.